Okay, in this lecture, which follows the introductory lecture, I'm just going to do a brief review of the ideology of separate spheres or women's sphere, and then talk a little bit about the jurisprudence forms that that ideology took. And then we'll go from there and go into some more detail. So, the notion that women require and deserve special treatment has a long history. In the 19th century, as we've seen, sex differentiated policies were justified by the ideology of separate spheres, or the discourse of a woman's sphere. This ideology, as we've seen, constructed women as inhabitants of a distinct realm of experience. Within their sphere, women were supposed to conform to specified social roles and to engage in appropriate womanly activities. The separate spheres ideology circumscribed the scope of women's legitimate activity, but it also seemed to offer a level of autonomy as well as the community of a supposedly universal sisterhood. And many of you got right to that paradox in our discussion, which I was really happy to see. Confined within the domestic bounds of the family unit, women could develop their special strengths and capabilities and even have socially approved access to certain kinds of power. The ideology of separate spheres, as we've seen, arose in the early 19th century, replacing several earlier conceptualizations of women's proper place. Among them, as we've seen, was the common law doctrine of coverture, which incorporated the legal identity of the femme covert within that of her father or her husband. Coverture presumed that the man represented the family household, and it denied other family members, for example, wives and daughters, social existence as independent persons, and legal existence as well. Imported from England, the doctrine of coverture was at some variance with the reality of life in the American colonies. We've seen that, even among those groups to whom it might most be expected to apply. Some women were, in fact, quite independent. Those who were heads of propertied households or whose husbands were away, for example. With the coming of the Revolution, the issue of women's independence as citizens or dependence as wives and daughters was broached, and then quickly resolved in favor of the latter. Not long after, we see sort of the full consolidation of the ideology of separate spheres. And in that process, the competing voices of the revolutionary era concerning the place of women were largely silenced. Now, one of the core elements of the ideology of separate spheres was the idea that women who bear children have special experiences and needs. And as in other times and places, the phenomenon that childbearing creates particular demands on women became universalized into this sort of global female identity. And motherhood became central to the idea of the true woman. So normative notions that women's proper place was in the home, meaning that her identity, not just her activities, but her very identity ought to derive from her role as wife or daughter, or more importantly, mother, within the household of a heterosexually bonded family unit, lasted well into the 20th century. And some would argue, and I think I'm one of them, that those normative notions continue today. Now, presumed to apply to all, This ideology of separate spheres shaped and reinforced social relations. That is, the domestic code of separate spheres ideology was a dominant ideology, and its power obscured the ways in which it was, in fact, highly race, class, and region specific. And as Wallach touched upon a little bit, and we also touched upon a little bit in discussion, that dominant ideology also obscured obscured the reality that not only was the ideology specific in terms of class, race, and region, it was specific very much in the sense that it was a white middle class based ideology, right, that became the universal, even though it really emanated from a small group of people. Separate spheres prescriptions drew mainly, as we've seen, on the experience of women in the upper layers of the New England class structure. Most American women weren't members of these sectors, and their lives differed dramatically from those lived by the so-called true women of the Eastern bourgeoisie. Separate spheres ideology, therefore, defined the experience of most women as, to a greater or lesser extent, abnormal. So, although hegemonic, it couldn't entirely obliterate the existence of other versions of womanhood. A historian by the name of Nancy Hewitt has summarized this, I think, quite well, and I want to read something from her work. She says this: evidence from the lives of slaves, mill operatives, miners' wives, immigrants, and Southern industrial workers, as well as from so-called true women, indicates that there was no single woman's culture or sphere. There was a culturally dominant definition of sexual spheres promulgated by an economically, politically, and socially dominant group. That definition was firmly grounded in the sexual division of labor appropriate to that class, meaning the middle class, upper middle class, upper class, just as other definitions developed based on the sexual division of labor in other class and racial groups. Okay, so the majority of women were participants in particular cultures, sometimes only dimly related to the ideology of separate spheres. Farthest from its canons, and we've read a little bit about this, was the experience of Black women, constituted from their African history on the one hand and the demands of being enslaved on the other. Even the women of the urban bourgeoisie weren't homogenous in culture and outlook. So the ideology of separate spheres worked to sort of render the rich diversity of American women's experience almost invisible. And if you think back, this ties in, right? This makes a connection, the way Ella likes to think about connections. If you think of the 1820s and 30s as this moment in political culture in the United States when individualism really began to emerge as sort of a real dominant ideology itself, right? The political individualism and independence of men as suffrage became universal for white men. The individualism, the sort of, ideology of individualism that's really required to make capitalism work, those ideologies are emerging at exactly the same time that this domestic sphere ideology is emerging. So, of course, the rich diversity of women's experience becomes obliterated through this doctrine, because that embrace of individualism was gendered. The individual was male. It didn't matter about women as individuals. They were all sort of lumped into this place, right? The sphere, the woman's sphere. They were wives, they were daughters, they were mothers. They were derivative, they were ancillary. They weren't individuals. They were just that other that was sort of opposite of the individual male. So not only was the ideology of separate spheres actually race, class, and region specific, it was also time bound. Dominant ideology can be stubbornly persistent, but at the same time, it can be remarkably malleable. Many of you spoke to this when in the discussion board, when you talked about the ways that that ideology provided a space for women to articulate, excuse me, sets of ideas and actually actions that challenged the very sphere in which these women existed. But in terms of time, the canons of domesticity that we've seen emerge in the early 1800s, assumed new forms less than a century later. So the ideology persists, right? But the forms in which it continues and survives, those forms can be historically contingent. Those forms can change over time. But if you look, the underlying ideology is the same. So what I want to do now is I want to shift a little bit and jump quite ahead in terms of chronology. And I want us to look at how the 1908 Supreme Court decision in Muller versus Oregon sort of exemplifies that shift in forms that I'm talking about. And I think one thing I hope that you'll take away from this is that we'll see that the court's voice was probably dominant in terms of expressing the dominant ideology, but it wasn't the only voice on the matter. So the takeaway is that the construction of normative notions of gender, really any normative notions, the construction of normative notions of gender is always contested. All right, so I'm going to shift here, and I want to talk about the sort of 19th century jurisprudential form of separate spheres ideology. And that form is really expressed in an opinion written by Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley in a case from 1873. And that case is Bradwell versus Illinois. The case concerned the right of Myra Colby Bradwell, who was defined in the case as, and I'm quoting here from the decision, a woman of learning, genius, industry, and high character. So it concerned the right of Bradwell to practice the profession of law. Bradwell was active in the women's suffrage movement and in efforts to reform Illinois laws that disadvantaged women. She was also the founding editor of a very important weekly, the Chicago Legal News. When she applied for admission to the Illinois bar in 1869, Bradwell was refused admission because of her sex. The Illinois Supreme Court and then the United States Supreme Court supported the state bar. And in agreeing to deny Bradwell the right to pursue her chosen profession, Justice Bradley articulated a fully elaborated view of the eternal and divinely ordained distinctions between the two sexes. And here I'm going to read to you some of Bradley's comments. He said, civil law, as well as nature herself, has always recognized a wide difference in the respective spheres and destinies of man and woman. The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. The paramount destiny and mission of woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. End quote. Conjuring up the tradition of coverture, Bradley suggested that women's independence was dangerous. He said, and I'm quoting again, the harmony, not to say identity, of interests and views which belong, or should belong, to the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. He said that although some women are not married, the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things, not to what he called exceptional cases. So Bradley not only assumed the separation between the two spheres was God-given and for all time, he regarded it as all-pervasive. No aspect of a woman's experience could escape gender assignment. Being a woman entailed being a wife, and being a wife meant remaining within the domestic sphere. When Myra Bradwell had applied to the Illinois bar, she sought the same right to practice law that men in her state employed. That is, her demand for equality took the form of a request for same treatment. Bradwell's efforts were part of a larger campaign challenging state laws and practices that constituted women as, by nature, different from men. The movement pushed current liberal theories of natural rights to their limits by seeking to extend them to women. Right? And we've seen this in the Declaration, the Seneca Falls Declaration. As the Declaration put it, all laws which prevent woman from occupying such a station in society as her conscience shall dictate, or which place her in a position inferior to that of a man, are contrary to the great precept of nature, and therefore of no force or authority. Woman is man's equal, was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she be recognized as such. So for the women's movement activists in the middle of the 19th century, campaigning for same treatment as citizens seemed like an obvious way to bring women within the norms of equality. Now, I just want to say as an aside, when I say, let's see, what did I say? Oh, I said that the movement, the women's campaign, right, challenging inequitable laws, that movement pushed current liberal theories of natural rights to their limits. I want to make sure that you understand that when I say liberal theories, I'm talking in the classical sense of liberal democracy, right? I'm not talking about liberal versus conservative. Okay, so a quarter of a century later, activist women continued to seek, and by a quarter of a century later, I mean after Seneca Falls, these women continued to seek same treatment, equal treatment in a number of areas. And they also worked very vigorously for passage of labor legislation treating some women differently from men. And here we're getting to the crux of the issue, and that is equal rights and special treatment. Okay, why? Well, social transformations that were wrought by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration had put the legal argument from about difference onto the reform agenda. And here's where I'm jumping ahead, so you may want to come back and listen to this lecture again or parts of it when we get further along next week. At the end of the 19th century, large numbers of working class women were employed outside the home for wages, usually occupying low-level positions in industry or as domestic servants. They were the approximately 25% of American women who worked in the paid labor force at the time. So, a quarter. Although most women workers left their jobs when they married, there were 10% of married women who worked for wages, and that wasn't an insubstantial number in absolute terms. The statistics changed over time and they varied according to race, ethnicity, and region. In industrial towns and cities with large immigrant populations, for example, as many as a third of the women working in the mills were married. The labor force participation of African American women, whether married or not, was always several times that of white women. Pay for women was low, not 77 cents on the dollar low like it is today, lower. They were crowded into a few occupations in a sex and race segregated labor market. They earned 60% or less of what men earned. On this amount, it was impossible for most women workers to live, even meagerly, apart from a family setting. Working conditions in shops, factories, and households were often brutal, and hours were extremely long. The labor movement was weak, it was craft-oriented, and it addressed the needs of women members even less adequately than it did those of men. Increasingly alarmed at the deteriorating conditions of working-class women's lives, activists campaigned for the passage of industrial legislation regulating the work of women, but not men. A strategy that singled out women for special treatment in the labor force could not rely on natural rights reasoning. The general argument for women's labor legislation, it was initiated in Europe and advanced wherever industrialization developed. The general argument started from the assumption that women's distinct physiology created special needs. Biology as destiny. So given these needs, and given, furthermore, working class women's role as the bearers of future citizen workers, in other words, their reproductive work, it was concluded that society had an interest in assuring the well-being of working women. In the campaign for protective labor legislation, women's difference, projected as physically based and scientifically verifiable, became the major theme. Okay, laws regulating women's work were first enacted in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. In 1853, for example, the state of Massachusetts limited women's working day to 11 hours. In 1874, Massachusetts reduced the maximum to 10 hours. In other words, it was illegal for a woman to work for wages more than 11 and then more than 10 hours a day. Now remember, this applied just to women. It did not apply to male workers. Most female-specific industrial legislation, in other words, protective labor legislation, was put in place around the turn of the 20th century. States limited hours, they restricted night work, and they excluded women from occupations that were viewed as physically or morally dangerous. Such occupations as metal grinder, underground miner, elevator operator, letter carrier, meter reader, or bartender were closed to women on the grounds that women workers might be exposed to physical or moral dangers inappropriate to their sphere. I'll leave aside for the moment the fact that many of these jobs were also good paying jobs. Okay, I won't digress. Passage of legislation affecting female but not male workers soon resulted in legal challenges. Lower courts didn't always agree on the validity of statutes mandating special provisions for women workers. Some used natural rights language to claim that protective labor laws were an improper limitation on the equal rights of all to control their destiny. So here's an example. In 1907, a New York court struck down a law that prohibited night work for women, and the court declared, "An adult woman is not to be regarded as a ward of the state or in any other light than the man is regarded when the question relates to the business, pursuit, or calling. She's entitled to enjoy unmolested her liberty of person and her freedom to work for whom she pleases, where she pleases, and as long as she pleases, within the general limitations operative on all persons alike." Like contemporary court decisions on labor legislation affecting men, opinions like this assumed that women workers and their employers were equally powerful actors in the marketplace for labor. Now, ironically, the affirmation of women's equal rights with respect to her, quote, business pursuit or calling was precisely what activist and would-be lawyer Myra Bradwell had fought for 30 years earlier. Now, while some courts invalidated these female-specific labor laws by emphasizing equal rights and freedom of contract, other courts upheld the laws on the basis of women's difference. Here's an example. The Nebraska Supreme Court cited a range of political, physical, and familial disabilities that were special to women in an opinion that they issued affirming Nebraska's 10-hour law in 1902. And here I'll read from their decision. The court said, "Women and children have always, to a certain extent, been wards of the state. Women in recent years have been partly emancipated from their common law disabilities, but they have no voice in the enactment of the laws by which they are governed and can take no part in municipal affairs. They are unable, by reason of their physical limitations, to endure the same hours of exhaustive labor as may be endured by adult males. Certain kinds of work, which may be performed by men without injury to their health, would wreck the constitutions and destroy the health of women, and render them incapable of bearing their share of the burdens of the family and the home." Okay, so in this interpretation, female-specific legislation is justified because it compensates for women's political powerlessness and preserves women's health, and thereby, according to the logic of the court, contributes to family and social welfare. Now, women's role as mothers was sometimes invoked more directly in order to defend protective laws. In 1900, the Pennsylvania Superior Court worried about the threat posed by unregulated working conditions to the health and safety of future generations. And the court said this: "Surely an act which prevents the mothers of our race from being tempted to endanger their life and health by exhaustive employment can be condemned by none save those who expect to profit by it." After all, seconded the Washington Supreme Court in 1902, in their words, "that which would deleteriously affect any great number of women who are the mothers of succeeding generations must necessarily affect the public welfare and the public morals." So here, the concern shifted away from women as citizens with special needs requiring special provisions. Instead, because women are mothers and hence entrusted with the well-being, quote, "of our race," the court reasoned they needed protective labor legislation. Lower courts remain divided over the validity of female-specific industrial legislation, protective labor legislation. And over a period of 32 years, state Supreme Courts decided 7 cases concerning legislation limiting women's hours or night work, upholding 4 of them and invalidating 3 of them. And then in its 1908 decision in Muller versus Oregon, the United States Supreme Court tried to settle the dispute. All right, I'm not going to end here. I'm going to continue, but if you want to take a break or come back to this podcast lecture, now would be a good time to do that, because I'm going to start up again in a subsection, the facts of common knowledge, and sort of walk you up to and into the Muller decision. First, I'm going to have a sip of tea. Okay, on Labor Day of 1905, Kurt Muller, owner of the Grand Laundry in Portland, Oregon, required a female employee to work beyond the legally limited working day. Convicted and fined under a 1903 state law prohibiting the employment of women for more than 10 hours a day, Muller challenged the law. He argued that the hours limitation unconstitutionally restricted women's freedom to contract, to work as long as they desired. When the Oregon Supreme Court upheld his conviction, Muller, supported by other local laundrymen, appealed, and he appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The court's ruling in the test case was expected to determine whether or not women workers were to be treated as free agents in the labor market. Now, freedom of contract had just been very firmly endorsed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1905 in a very famous court case, Lochner versus New York. Now, in the Lochner decision, the court invalidated New York's law limiting hours worked in bakeries on the basis that it interfered with workers' constitutionally guaranteed freedom to bargain with their employers. The court noted that states had the right to limit this 14th Amendment freedom through exercise of their, quote, police powers in the areas of safety, health, morals, and general welfare of the public. But the court determined that the New York law was not a valid exercise of such powers. Instead, laws that limit the hours in which grown and intelligent men may labor to earn their living are mere meddlesome interferences with the rights of the individual. Now, it's important to point out that the Lochner decision was a very conservative decision in terms of labor legislation, because unions had tried to limit the hours of work, right? If you work an 8-hour day and get overtime if you work more than that, thank a labor union, right? So this idea of the liberty of contract was it was an idea that was used by employers to argue that any sort of demands that workers might make for limited work hours, that sort of thing, actually infringed upon their freedom, sort of like right to work laws, which are now nationwide thanks to the recent case that I can't think of the name of. Anyway, so conveniently ignoring the reality that workers participate in the labor market with considerably less power than their bosses, the court deprived New York's bakers of state protection. Might it not do the same should it have to decide a case involving industrial legislation applying only to women? This was the fear that haunted advocates of protectionism as Muller versus Oregon reached the United States Supreme Court, that it would be overturned, and you would see sort of this general triumph of the power of employers over the power of workers. Okay, so in an effort to influence the decision in Muller, the reformers joined with the state of Oregon to present a brief to the Supreme Court. Now, the brief was prepared by Louis Brandeis, who of course goes on to be one of the greatest Supreme Court justices ever, and Josephine Goldmark, and it offered the legal argument that female-specific hours laws are rational. So it therefore had to distinguish the Oregon 10-hour statute from that New York law that had been struck down in Lochner. At stake in Oregon, but not in New York, the brief claimed, were the, and here I'm quoting, public health, safety, morals, or welfare. Precisely the categories acknowledged by the court in Lochner and other precedents as falling within the scope of a state's powers, state's police powers under the 14th Amendment. The so-called, and I'm quoting, facts of common knowledge, close quote, concerning sexual difference show that if women's working day is not limited, there is material danger to public health, safety, morals, or welfare. Because women differ from men in certain factually verifiable ways pertaining to the relevant categories, this is what the brief was advising, the state may depart from the principle of freedom of contract endorsed in Lochner. Okay, in other words, sexual difference, biological difference, justifies making an exception to the doctrine of liberty of contract. That is, unlike the so-called grown and intelligent men whose individual rights were endorsed in Lochner, women needed the protection of the state, and Oregon's law is valid. Sexual difference established women as a distinct class whose special treatment was constitutionally justifiable. Now, that legal argument was made in a scant 2 pages of the Brandeis-Goldmark brief, and it turned on establishing the facts of common knowledge, that in the prescribed areas of health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. And these were presented in the brief's remaining 100 and something pages, organized in 2 unevenly sized parts. There was a short part one that overviewed legislation limiting women's work hours in Europe and in 20 of the US states. And these laws enacted, again, quote, for the protection of women's health and safety and the public welfare. They were presented as a kind of precedent in the brief. Now, part two was titled The World's Experience Upon Which the Legislation Limiting the Hours of Labor for Women is Based. And that part two contained the bulk of the reformers' exposition of, quote, facts. And it was here that Brandeis and Goldmark amassed dozens of short citations from European as well as US legislative, governmental, medical, and scholarly reports. The citations exhibit a mix of empirical observations and interpretations that makes it difficult by modern standards to see them as facts. At the time, however, the introduction of such data into a legal brief was actually a really radical innovation, and it was seemingly executed in scientific fashion. Brandeis and Goldmark provided a 1 or 2 paragraph preface to each group of citations, indicating for the justices the point to be drawn. The first section of part two was called The Dangers of Long Hours, and it argued that long hours were particularly dangerous for women, quote, because of their special physical organization, close quote, and also because of the intensification of labor due to technological change. The section then considered the effects of long hours on, in turn, health, then safety, morals, general welfare. The longest subsection documented the impact of overwork on women's health. And it said this: the fatigue which follows long hours of labor becomes chronic and results in general deterioration of health. Often ignored, since it does not result in immediate disease, this weakness and anemia undermines the whole system. It destroys the nervous energy most necessary for steady work and effectually predisposes to other illnesses. Close quote. Medical commissioners observed neurasthenia, insomnia, headache, ulcers, swelling, varicose veins, constipation, lassitude, reduced lung capacity, pulmonary disease, and general torpidity of functions. A Massachusetts government committee noted that in the cotton mills of Fitchburg, the women and children are pale, crooked, and sickly looking. One committee in Maine found that many saleswomen are so worn out when their week's work is ended that a good part of their Sundays is spent in bed, recuperating for the next week's demands. So in addition to the generally harmful impact of long hours on women's health, Brandeis and Goldmark enumerated what they called specific evil effects on childbirth and female functions. And among those were pelvic disease, premature birth, and menstrual problems. According to a print shop foreman, for example, female compositors, as a rule, are sickly, suffering much from backache, headache, weak limbs, and general female weakness. A short subsection on safety documented that fatigue increased the chances of injury due to accidents. Another, equally short, considered morals and claimed that long hours produced a tendency to drink and referred darkly to, quote, other excesses. Brandeis and Goldmark devoted the concluding pages of the briefs section on long hours to describing how overwork endangered the general welfare. And they said that when the health of women has been injured by long hours, not only is the working efficiency of the community impaired, but the deterioration is handed down to succeeding generations. The overwork of future mothers, thus directly attacks the welfare of the nation. The state, therefore, they concluded, had an interest in protecting women. So then, after it surveys the dangers of long hours, the brief then moved on to the advantages of short hours, considering health and general welfare in turn. Then, the brief went on to reassure the court that the economic effects of shortened hours wouldn't be harmful, and that physicians, employees, employers, and officials affirmed the positive impact of limiting work hours. Then there was a final section that presented data on conditions in the laundry industry, described as one of the dangerous trades whose employees are worn out while still young. Then, in a one-paragraph conclusion, Brandeis and Goldmark returned to the legal argument, and they said this: in view of the facts above set forth, it cannot be said that the legislature of Oregon had no reasonable ground for believing that the public health, safety, or welfare did not require a legal limitation on women's work to 10 hours in one day. That is, the Oregon law ought to be declared valid. Now, implicit in these facts of common knowledge assembled by Brandeis and Goldmark are several distinct rationales for restricting the hours of women but not men. First, and most prominent, overwork was harder on women physically because they had a more delicate physical organization. Now, while the citations documented the harmful impact of long hours on male as well as female workers, the brief argued at length that women have a physiologically greater need for the reduction in hours. In general, it said that disease makes greater inroads among them, meaning women. Industrial labor is more injurious to women than to men. The second rationale, briefly mentioned, pointed to the pressures created by women's differential responsibilities in the household. And it said this: desirable would be a reduction of the working hours, which should give to married women more time for their housework and family life, and to younger unmarried women the opportunity to learn the art of homemaking, because upon this, the health, welfare, and prosperity of her whole family will depend. So it was physical makeup and social role in the domestic sphere together that made women more vulnerable than men to the damaging effects of overwork. And those facts suggested that working class women as individuals needed the protection of a law restricting hours. The brief also offered a third reason to limit women's working hours, but that reason wasn't based on individual welfare, but on general welfare. Women had to be protected because they made an indispensable contribution to societies as mothers. In other words, through reproduction. That women's value to society, first and foremost, was as reproducers. And the brief said that the efficiency and value of future generations depended upon the protection of working women and girls. Arguments like this, which represented working class women as vehicles for the biological and social perpetuation of society, were very common by the end of the 19th century. They justified shorter hours for women on the instrumentalist basis that the state had a vital interest, and by state, I mean, with a big S, not an individual state, but the state, the nation. The nation had a vital interest in securing for itself future generations capable of living and maintaining it. Throughout the brief, inspectors, physicians, officials, and legislative committees, as well as Brandeis and Goldmark themselves, made comments that strike many modern readers as sexist. You know, women are fundamentally weaker than men in all that makes for endurance. They're weaker in muscular strength and nervous energy. They're weaker in their powers of persistent attention and application. You know, they argued that women's, and here I'm quoting, physical inferiority made them vulnerable. They argued that legislators should protect and preserve the health of the women in their character as wives and as the mothers of future generations. So, taken in isolation, those extracts portray women workers as needing state protection, mainly so their extraordinary physical fragility won't obstruct their socially central function as wives and mothers. Absent from this picture, but not from the brief, is the reformers' emphasis on the well-being of women as persons in their own right. So the paternalism and indeed patriarchalism of many formulations in the Brandeis-Goldmark brief have been particularly galling to contemporary feminist sensibilities. The brief is generally believed to have not only provided legal logic, but also shaped the motherhood-based argument that is at the core of the Supreme Court opinion. But let's make two observations. First, such references were in part necessitated by the legal argument adopted by the reformers, because they had to show that unlike Lochner, right, the New York law overturned in Lochner, the preservation of public morals and the general welfare as well as of health and safety required hours limitations. And second, and more importantly, a fair reading of the entire brief discloses that its emphasis was, in fact, on the threat to women's health and physical well-being constituted by long hours. So modern readings of the brief have sometimes been selective, filtering out the greater part of what it contains. And by projecting the conclusions reached by the Supreme Court in Muller back onto the Brandeis-Goldmark brief, sometimes contemporary scholars often obscure the critical tension between the two documents, between the brief and between the Supreme Court decision. And I'm going to talk about that next, but I'm going to take a break here. So what I want to emphasize again is that while their language strikes our ears as, you know, sort of horrifyingly sexist, it is important to remember that Brandeis and Goldmark were very liberal activists and reformers, and that while their language demonstrates the extent to which they, like most others, sort of were products of this dominant ideology of separate spheres and women's difference, they were arguing from a position that advocated for the well-being of working class women. All right, so I'm going to end this lecture here because it's been pretty long and I've given you a lot of detail to digest. And then I'll come back with a third lecture which looks more closely at the decision in Muller versus Oregon, which was a unanimous decision, and then tie that in a little bit to the bigger picture. Okay, so that is it for part 2 of the lecture, and I'll be back later with part 3.